You're listening to the #1 podcast for nonprofit leaders, getting your nonprofit fully funded. This is the Fundraising Masterminds Podcast. All right, well, today we're going to be talking about a major donor personalized development plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is, to be honest with you, and it is probably less complicated than you would think, and extremely valuable when you're trying to target and pinpoint. You know, there's a difference between doing development in a shotgun approach. That tends to be more how we do direct mail. But when we get to the rifle approach, where we're focusing in like a laser beam on the results, that's when you have the greatest success.
Okay. So, yeah, I think before we get into all the details, if you wouldn't mind just subscribing to our YouTube channel while you're here. We release weekly podcast episodes for nonprofit leaders in the area of donor development, marketing, nonprofit news, nonprofit anything.
Leadership.
Right? Leadership. We really want you to subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. And if you wouldn't mind just writing a comment, if you have any questions as you're going through this episode, that would really help us to create more new content for you.
Yep.
So I think before we get into this topic, I would really like to define what a major donor even is.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Do you define a major donor as someone who gives over a certain dollar amount? What is the dollar amount that makes a major donor? Is it 500, 1,000, 10,000?
Well, as you can imagine, Jason, every organization is different because you've got some organizations, nonprofits, whose annual budget's 50,000, and you've got some organization whose annual budget is 50 million.
Right.
So defining a major donor is different. But if I had to say across the board, for most of the individual organizations watching this program, a major donor is defined as a largest single gift of $5,000 or more. So in other words, someone who could take out their checkbook or credit card and make a gift of $5,000 on the spot. Now, as an example, you and I might be able to write a check out for $400, but it would be very difficult for you and I to sit down and write out a check for $4,800. Yeah. So we don't want an individual that would write a check for $480 a month, but we do want somebody who's going to write a check out for $4,800, $5,000. So $5,000 above. Now, that's the typical. If you've got a larger organization.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it based on like the percentage of the total budget or something?
Well, it's really based on the percentage of how many donors you've got in that category. So remember that I like to use that 80-20 principle. I call that the critical few. The 20% of your people who bring in 80% of your dollars. Right. And so you really want to take a look at that 20%. Now, if a good majority of your 20% are giving over 10,000 or over 25,000, those individuals you may move that line up a little bit based on that. Okay. Now, I typically go two categories. I'll either go major or mega donor. Okay. And so I've got mass, middle, major, and mega. And so I'll usually define major as 5,000 to 999 to 9999 for just before 10,000 and 10,000 above for our mega donors. Now, some organizations will go to 25,000 and megas will be $25,000 and above. So that kind of gives you an idea.
Right. So would you recommend if you're just getting started, like a lot of organizations probably aren't that organized, right? They just have all their donors in a big pot.
Yeah.
Would you recommend, exporting a list of all the donations that have been made and, putting them into those categories that you said?
Well, I would. In fact, we typically call that segmenting. And what you're doing is if you've got a CRM, which most organizations today have a CRM or have access to a CRM. Right. You can make a select request and ask for anyone who's given a largest single gift of $5,000 and above, and that will categorize that. If for some reason you don't have that and you are in a system, then you may just either choose a particular category. You could list out on a spreadsheet. This is really going old school in a sense.
Right.
You list out on a spreadsheet spreadsheet every gift that you've gotten, and then essentially draw a line at that $5,000 mark, and then take everybody above that.
So what we're talking about is everyone above that $5,000 mark.
Right.
And we're really talking about everyone in that $5,000 mark or above.
Right.
And then how to create a personalized plan for them.
Right.
And are we talking about, like when you say personalized plan, are you talking about like relationship, like building a relationship?
Right.
Or are you talking about how to get them to give more?
Well,
or get them to move
the
their
answer
giving?
is yes, in a sense, because to have that personalized communication strategy, one of the key elements of that strategy is asking them for money and when to ask them for the money. So that's all part of the plan.
So you're essentially, saying that we want to be working with, this specific podcast is addressing the major donors, and we really are specifically wanting to create a plan for developing those major donors.
Right.
When you talk about developing them, are you referring to developing them in terms of getting to know them better, like the relationship, or are you talking about getting them to increase their levels of giving or involvement? What exactly? You're referring to some kind of plan,
right?
But what exactly is the plan that you're referring to, and what is the goal of the plan?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Jason. I mentioned in the very beginning the difference between the shotgun approach and the rifle approach. The shotgun approach treats everyone exactly the same. So you're putting out a direct mail letter out to
5,000 people.
5,000 people, and you are treating them all the same. You may, in some cases, change the salutation to Dear Jim and Diane Dempsey, but in most cases they're all the same. You're asking for the same amount. They're all getting the same package. What I'm talking about here is creating an individual plan for every one of your major donors. So you are not treating all your major donors exactly alike. You're creating an individualized communication plan and an individualized strategy for when to ask and how to ask and what to ask for when you are putting together a plan for those people. So you got to be careful not to have too many people in this, because as you can imagine, it would be if you had...
Well, why do we need an individualized plan for each person? Why can't we just lump them all together and say, okay, assuming that they're generally all in the same income category, say like, okay, just maybe we do a special dinner for them, or we treat them, a little differently. But why do we need to make an individualized plan?
Jason, let me ask you this. I know you've got 10 kids. Do you treat all your kids exactly the same? Why not? I mean, they're all kids. They're all children. They're all from the same parents. Remind me, how many packs of magic cards did all your kids get last summer? Oh, that's right. One of your kids got magic cards. That's because that one child had an interest in magic cards and in magic tricks. And when those cards came, because I was at your house, they were valued. They were put in a Foot Locker and locked in a protective area so that they didn't get confused with everybody else's, because that person had different desires than everybody else. It's exactly the same way with our major donors. They have interests. They have different desires. You could treat everyone the same, but you would...
It'd be easier to treat them all
it would. Sure would.
Or maybe it wouldn't. I don't know.
Well, no, in some ways it's easier to treat everyone alike, but then you're like an assembly line.
And when you lose the personalization.
That's when Or let's put it in reverse. When you add the personalization, that's when you really develop a relationship with someone. And that's what we're wanting to do. Remember, it's not about the money. It's not about fundraising. It's about the relationship. It's about that long term. And the only way you're going to really go deep with someone is understanding their interests, their desires, and in a sense, helping to pinpoint those and help them accomplish what their plans are. Yeah, for sure. So developing that, and now that's where I was headed. I said, you don't want to have too many people in there, because if you had 250 people, you couldn't really realistically create a good development plan. So you probably need to be looking at anywhere between 50 and about 60 people that you are going to run through for a personalized development plan.
Now, is this something that the executive director would be mostly in charge of? Because I know that a lot of organizations have a development director, and the development director a lot of times is kind of more that, they're doing the social media, they're doing mass mailings, they're doing all this stuff. And the executive director is kind of like, the top, the visionary, the main leader.
Yeah.
Is this something that's kind of reserved for the executive director to develop those relationships?
Yeah. Well, from my standpoint, I believe a good development director should be able to tee things up for the executive director. If we're talking about softball, they don't fire it in fast. They lob it in so that the executive director can hit it out of the ballpark. That's what we're talking about here. Now, the beauty of this plan is that this plan, though, is not just dependent about the executive director. The development director can do it. Board members can do it. Senior level executives can do it. So, in other words, you could take a list of 50 to 100 people, and you could break it up and give the top 10 to the executive director, the next 20 to the development director, and then 5 apiece to your board members. And each of them would be working the same individualized plan, but just within a manageable group of people.
Right.
All those people need to play an important role. I think one of the biggest things, and we'll do another podcast on this one, but the role of the executive director in fundraising and in development. And an executive director can't step away. Think about a university. Most major universities today, what is the primary role of the president of the university? Fundraising. And so we cannot allow an executive director who has a development director to sit on their hands and say, you know what, that's not my job. It's the job of the development director to do fundraising. Nope. It's a team effort. Now, is it the responsibility of the development director to tee this up, to set up this strategy, to find out who are going to be the people that the leadership is going to call, in what way, and for what particular causes? Absolutely, all those things are so important.
Well, I'm thinking of a ministry, and I'm thinking that you're going to read my mind very quickly, but there was an organization that we both worked with a long time ago.
Yes.
That the executive director tried to release all his responsibilities to the development director, and it just never really went that well. The development director felt frustrated because he didn't have the relationships that the executive director had, and the executive director felt frustrated because he was trying to free himself up, but he really couldn't free himself up. And I don't know if they ever really figured out how to work together. So it's interesting that you're talking about that.
Well, Jason, let me ask you this question, because I know you know the answer now. What's the life expectancy of a development person?
It is 18 months.
That's exactly right. And you know why it typically is 18 months? It really comes down to expectations. Unrealistic expectations. The development director comes in with their own expectations of what the job is going to be, and the executive director has their expectations, and the board has their expectations. And usually those expectations are totally different. They're not on the same page. So using the example that you had, I think, knowing the situation, the executive director had his expectations, and that included turning things over, but then you had the development director who expected to have things turned over, and he had expectations, and the two were definitely not on the same page as expectations. And as a result, within 18 months to 2 years, that person was no longer employed with the organization because the two didn't have the same expectations.
Right.
So you have got to make sure that your executive director and your development director and your board all are on the same page together.
Now, when you talk about like this plan, is that related to setting expectations? Does that help align the expectations?
It does. It does, because overall, you need to find out what you hope to accomplish with each of these people. If your executive director goes in there thinking that, this person should easily be able to give a gift of $100,000, and the development director finds out that the person only has an income of $50,000, there's got to be an alignment on there. That's why The development director cannot live in a vacuum. They can't be in an island all by themselves. They've got to have cooperation with the executive director. Now, the challenge that exists in our day and age is that the executive director has to be willing to embrace development and has to want to be part of that process. Because I can't tell you how frustrating I've seen development directors who can't get their executive directors to meet with them. Some say, well, it takes me 3 weeks or a month to get an appointment with an executive director. If you're the development director and you haven't established a regular time for communication, there's issues there. The executive director needs to be willing pretty much to say, you tell me where to go, what to do, and I'll do it. I mean, that's kind of, within reason in their schedule, but they should be willing to be there to do that.
Yeah. Kind of like in business, like the development director is kind of like the operations person, right? They're like operating the relationships of the donors, right? And they're basically serving that up to the CEO, and the CEO is just there to make the big decisions. I don't know if that's a great analogy.
Well, I liken it more to a band in that the conductor for the band is your development person, and your president is one of the key instruments in that. Whether it's a violin, oboe, whatever it is, but your executive director, just follows the lead of the conductor.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm really curious to know what this plan is, but I think I have an idea for how to do this plan.
Okay.
Rather than sharing what the plan is and giving away all those dirty little secrets on this podcast, I think what we're going to do is put together a little PDF that explains what the plan is. That way you can download it, you can read it, you could share it with different people. And again, we'll probably just ask for your name and email in exchange for that.
Yep.
But I think that's a fairly, fair exchange.
Fairly reasonable. Yes, fairly reasonable.
We won't make it a charge or anything. But but just briefly tell me if this downloadable PDF with this plan had a name, what would you call it?
Well, I would call it the 3331 plan.
Okay.
And it includes communication with notes and letters and emails. It includes communication with phone calls, and it includes personal visits.
Okay.
And there needs to be a plan and a structure for that. And we will be sharing, if just you simply give us your name and your email information, and we'll send that plan to you, and you can incorporate it. But it talks about individually incorporating a plan. And I'll tell you, Jason, I'll give you an example of someone who didn't follow a plan. About the late 1990s, I had a colleague.
Okay.
We had a strategy within Crew that's called everystudent.com, which is still today, 20 years later, probably one of our hottest strategies for getting the gospel out to the world. And it is a resource that anyone Googling who is Jesus, who is God, what is heaven, they're going to get everystudent.com. And we, through working with Google and other search engines, we ensure that we are one of the top searches for that because we want people to use this resource. Well, it has been a hot commodity from the very beginning.
Right.
So when our reps, our major donor representatives, started visiting people, it was so easy. We'd serve it up on a platter, and people would say, how do I sign up? Where do I give? And they couldn't give fast enough.
Right.
So it's an amazing thing to have happen.
Yeah.
And one of my colleagues, by his own admission, got a little overconfident. And he went to go meet with an older couple. And the couple said, love to hear about what your latest strategies are. Well, instead of doing his normal plan for rationale and talking about things and starting with questions and asking, what's your interest? What's your desires? What are things you want to do? He just went right for the gut. He just, he said, this is what you need to be giving to. And this is internet based, and the internet hadn't been around that long, so that's what made it so unique. The first words out of this man's mouth was, "You just need to know that I believe the internet is of Satan, and my wife thinks it's even worse than that." He immediately was shut down. And he learned a valuable lesson that day, that he went in without a plan, without a strategy, took it for granted that these people were going to just be like everybody else, and were going to just buy into the everystudent.com strategy. And he left with his tail between his legs, embarrassed as could be, came into our office like a little sheepish, and had made a huge mistake with a major donor. And he had no backup because he didn't ask any questions beforehand, and he didn't have a backup for other alternative programs to present to, because he thought these people, this would be an easy slam dunk for them. That's what happens when you go in and you don't have a plan. Now, when we're talking about the 333 plan, we will work with you on having a personalized communication of how and when to get emails and notes to people, how and when to make phone calls, how and when to do personal visits with people, but also how to ask people and when to ask people for that gift. And remember, we talk about win, keep, and lift. Right. This is part of the keeping strategy. You've already got them. They're already part of the critical few, but you want to keep them and you want to lift them to higher levels of giving. So this is all part of that individualized strategy.
Yeah. Well, that sounds really, really helpful. How do I get this plan?
Yeah, all we need you to do is click on the link in the description, and just all we're asking for is just your name and email address, and we'll send that right to you, and you'll be able to incorporate that into your development strategy today.
Well, thank you again for tuning in to this week's episode of the Fundraising Masterminds Podcast. And if you found this episode to be helpful, please subscribe on our YouTube channel. If something didn't make sense, or if you have a question about major donors, please write that question in the comments, because we would really love to hear from you. And again, the 3331 plan that Jim mentioned is going to be available in the description of this podcast episode. So definitely look for that link. It's going to take you to a landing page, and we're going to ask you for your name and your email, which I think is fair to, get a plan like this. It sounds like a very great resource. So thank you, Jim, for putting that plan together.
Absolutely.
And again, we hope that it really helps you. Well, that's it for this episode of Fundraising Masterminds. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.